Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to see everyone. It is an exciting time. New Bible classes start this Sunday, and so Steve gave a hard sell for everyone just to go back into the Psalms this morning. Thankfully, you didn't. Thank you. Even though I thought about joining, go back there. But anyway, so we are continuing the study of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Old Testament, the books of Moses, tribute to Moses. And so, really, I think David and Doug kind of queued this up at the end of their study. For me, this has been a very enjoyable study. Hopefully it has been for everyone else. I was trying to think the last time we kind of worked through, some of these books in its entirety. Now, again, over 13 weeks, granted. But to me, it seems like when I've studied these things, it's normally you study the stories, right? You study the individual stories themselves, the covenant with Abraham, the Joseph being sold to slavery, or Moses and the Exodus, or the plagues. But really what we're trying to do, I believe, is kind of work through these in its entirety. And so for me anyway, it gave me a little bit different perspective, being able to dig deeper into some of those Genesis accounts, and hopefully you felt the same way. So we're going to continue that mantra, that theme, as we move into the Exodus. Let me ask you, though, David kind of alluded to this, or spent some time, I should say, last week doing this. We just finished up studying Genesis. How would you describe the ending of the book of Genesis? What do you think? How would you describe it? You're reading it for the first time. You read the entire book of Genesis, and the book closes. What are you feeling? I'm sorry? Bondage? Okay. Okay, cliffhanger, yeah. Other thoughts? And Doug and David did a great job. Genesis is all about a book of excitement, right? There's a lot of action. There's a lot of things going on. We read about the story of how our world came to being, the origins of humanity. We read about sin. We read about rebellion. We read about a judgment event. Stephen alluded to it this morning about the floods. We read about the special family, the special covenant that was made to Abraham. And we read about that through this family, all the families, including you and I, are going to receive God's blessings. And so we get to the end of Genesis, of those promises. Are they fulfilled yet? No. I would argue Genesis is left off like a cliffhanger, if you will, in the sense of, hey, we read about all these great promises that were happening, and we come to the end of Genesis, and none of them have happened yet. Think about that. The promises were given to Abraham. We are literally, 4 generations deep now, and we're still waiting on the promises of God. So maybe there's a lesson application for ourselves in terms about timelines in relation to God timelines. But so it's with great excitement then, I hope, that now we start into Exodus, and we are going to see the fruition of some of these promises. When and how is God going to deliver on the promises He made to the patriarch Abraham? And so that's really what I think John and I are going to, hopefully going to lead us through over the next 13 weeks. This is really just a continuation of the momentum and the great story of redemption of the book of Genesis. Agreed? Okay. Here is, not that you necessarily need to know this, but here's kind of where we're going. Roadmap here. There are 40 chapters in the book of Exodus. So roughly at the beginning anyway, we're going to cover probably 2 to 3 chapters a class period. There's the titles, there's the dates, doesn't necessarily mean anything. As we get later on, some of those bigger events in May happen over longer periods of scripture here, so we'll kind of tackle those together. But in essence, this is the plan. This is the blueprint of where we're going in this study. Yes?
When I said bondage, it ended with God foretelling Abraham that the people would enter into that.
That's right. That's right.
All of the greatness of the promises.
Yep. Which is interesting because God specifically tells Abraham that your people will suffer, and there will be, I'm some reason I think he used the term almost like through the furnace, I believe, or trial by furnace, if you will, or trial by fire, I guess I should say more accurately. Yet we haven't seen that happen yet, but we're about to this morning as well. Yep, good clarification. Okay. One of the things that, again, David and Doug started, that John and I hope to continue, is that as we read the book of Exodus in particular, this narrative becomes almost self-evident in the sense of it's pointing to something, right? There are foreshadows, allegories, direct correlations between what we read in Exodus versus what we know as New Testament readers and believers of the coming of Jesus and the gospel. And so it'll be our attempt to connect those points for us as we go along, because I think that'll help talks through the continuity of the Scriptures. That these aren't necessarily standalone. Yes, they're standalone narratives and history and things like that, but along the way, talk about Steve's sermon this morning, God's redemption plan of mankind is ever moving forward to the coming of the gospel, coming to Jesus. And we're going to see that specifically in the book of Exodus as well. Okay. One final comment, I guess, and then we'll actually get into the meat of it. Daniel's not in here, I don't think. Yeah, he's teaching. Some would suggest you can't study can't enter into a study without having a thematic theme, right, or a theme of the study. Some would suggest you can't do that, and that'd be horrible, right? So it's probably very boring and very vanilla, especially to those said individuals that believe that. But the theme that you can see on the screen there is be delivered. The book of Exodus is a story of deliverance. The story of deliverance that Brian already alluded to as well. So that's something we're going to see as we go along. How God delivers. We're going to see how God delivers His people over and over and over again throughout this book. And of course, from a correlation perspective, I think we can easily see and understand how God delivers us today from slavery, from bondage, of course, the slavery and bondage of sin. And so be delivered is going to be what we'll use from a thematic perspective, so we can certainly check that box. Any questions before we move into the study? All right, guys. Let's jump in. Exodus chapter 1. We're going to look at the first two chapters today. And really, I was talking to Jim before class. I mean, the first two chapters, I think, are probably we're probably familiar with these stories quite a bit, or at least the beginnings of how this works, or how it looks, I should say. So it should be maybe somewhat of a review, nothing groundbreaking from a narrative perspective. Look at the first 7 verses. It said, "These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons." David talked about this last week as I wrapped up Genesis. Joseph, though, as we know, was already in Egypt. It says, "Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them." So even right at the beginning of the book here, we're starting to see, okay, remember the promise to Abraham. You will have a mighty nation, a great nation, a lot of people. And so we're starting to see that just in the very beginning of this book. Question, I guess. The name Exodus, does that sound like a Hebrew word to you? Exodus? Okay, coming out, okay. From a meaning perspective, Harrison? What do you think? Is it Hebrew? John's saying no. Robert? No? What nationality of word is the word Exodus? You may know? Greek. Greek. It's a Greek word. It's a Greek word. So that's kind of odd, right? Why is a Greek word the title of this book? And so really, Exodus was not the original name, to be clear. It was the one giving at the writing of the Septuagint, right? So you remember the time between the Testaments, right? Between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Septuagint was a Greek translation of the Old Testament. And so Exodus, that term, became much later. Hebrews, the Hebrew people, you know what they call this book? It's called Shemot. S-H-M-O-T. S-H-M-O-T. Shemot. You know what that means? It means names. 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 Names, like someone's name. Names. Names. Shemot means names. They call this book Shemot, which S-H apostrophe M-O-T. Hebrew word. Shemot. And it means names. Which I think, again, think about the first verse here. These are the names of the sons of Israel, everyone according to their household. The names of Shemot. So think about that for a second, because I think there is a little bit of significance there. To ancient Hebrew, a name was not just a unique identifier, of a person, right? We know that. That wasn't just, hey, your name's Jordan. No, there was something more to that. Generally, a person's name spoke of someone's character or their future destiny, right? So think about, I think we know several examples. Moses, we're going to talk about here in a second. Moses means to draw out. We know that. Think of Elijah. His name is the Lord is my life, and his life was marked by strong, uncompromising stands for the Lord. Think about Joshua. God is salvation. So the point is, yes, in Hebrew, to Hebrews, names mean something. Names mean something more valuable than just the personal identifier, if you will. And so, here's my point. I wonder if God wants us to understand, if God wanted his people to understand here that what he's about to say in this narrative, if you will, the people of old, that in this book, he knew the names, he knew the characters, he knew the destiny of all these people he mentioned up top here. Yes, we know these are the sons of Israel, and these are the names of the future tribes. But not only that, it says that all the sons of Jacob were 70 persons, each one according to his household specifically. And so, in the beginning of this book of names, we read that God, or the application, I think I would suggest, but from the beginning, God knew these individuals. He was watching over them. Yes, there's going to be many struggles and twists and turns along the way. Brian's already alluded to that. In fact, God already told Abraham what's going to happen. But yet, in this narrative, in the beginning of this book, God knew his people. And he would watch over them because they had a bigger destiny or point to serve. Does that make sense? Yeah. Maybe it's somewhat insignificant, I don't know, but it is call it a fun fact, if you will. Fun fact. At least to me, maybe to David. Okay. All right, so let's talk about that. So a problem happened though, right? Okay, so 70 people go down to Egypt. Things are good. We talked about that in Genesis, right? Joseph's second in all of command of Egypt. They're given a great land, the land of Goshen. We read that Pharaoh and Jacob had an interaction. Jacob blessed Pharaoh. We read that Pharaoh offered, I would say, some jobs to them if they want to be herdsmen over Pharaoh's house and whatnot. So things were good. But a problem happened. What was the problem? Oh, that's right, Dan. That's right. New leadership came into play. New leadership came into play. And with that new leadership, we're going to implement some changes. Yeah, absolutely. We're going to implement some changes. And so in the beginning, yes, Joseph, his family, God's people were honored in Egypt. But now the new Pharaoh wasn't happy. And so we're going to put some new changes in effect. What was he not happy about? Okay. He was, it was a quantity situation, right? There's too many people in this land. But why would that be a bad thing? Remember? Overpower? Okay. A little bit more of that, Albert. What was hey Pharaoh, we haven't read it yet. What was he specifically worried about? Okay. That's what it is. That's what it is. The Egyptians were conquerors, right? We read that. Historically, that tells us and whatnot. There's a lot of war going on. Pharaoh's concern was, hey, what if these people allied themselves with our enemies? That would be a horrific situation. So yes, Egypt is constantly warring and broadening, expanding control and power and whatnot. What if these internal population here, what if they jump sides? So now not only do we have to fight maybe outside of Egypt, but now we have internal conflict within. So That's what he was afraid of. The size of them, how quickly they were multiplying, and oh my goodness, what happens if they join the other side? Ryan?
The other side is probably
all these millions of people labor.
Sure.
He couldn't give them up.
Yeah. Of course, they weren't the slaves at first, though. They weren't the slaves at first, but the problem was there's so many of them, and so I would argue that that was one of the attempts of the solution was to enslave them, yeah. Which, of course, as we all understand, has already been prophesied by God, or told by God, I should say. But yeah. Okay, let's read a couple verses here. Look in verse 8. Dan, this is your point. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel, so they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work of the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made themselves work as slaves. And so I'm going to suggest to you that Pharaoh has a solution to this problem that we just read about. And really, frankly, it's a 3-step program, okay? We just read step 1. What's the first thing he's going to do? How do you deal with this problem? Control them. Yeah, control the adults, right? Afflicting the adults with bondage, with servitude. One of the things I think is maybe lost on me, I won't speak for you, but how long were the people in Israel, how long were they in Egypt total? 400 years. That's a long time. I don't know if I always think about that perspective as just a silly, simple illustration. How long has the United States been around? Okay, math whiz. I believe in July it'll be 248. 248 years. So, if our Egyptian story, if you will, started at the founding at the same time as the U.S. United States of America, we would still have 152 years left of being in Egypt. Think about that for a second. That is a very, very, very long time. Very, very long time. And so, the point is, this massive people were growing over this very, very long time. And during the centuries that they were in Egypt, no doubt they had seen Egyptian, probably dynasties, right, come to power and fade multiple times. But this new king, this new Pharaoh, I would say was completely ignorant of Joseph, or maybe just didn't want to accept the historical narrative that Joseph and his family had helped the Egyptians so many years ago. But again, guys, to be clear, we're talking centuries ago. But he did not know Joseph, nor the generation of Joseph. And so he tried to destroy them, or I shouldn't say destroy, but limit them in a major capacity by afflicting these adults, these people, with bondage. Verse 11 says that the Egyptians set taskmasters over them and afflict them with heavy burdens. They built these special store cities for Pharaoh. But the key is verse 12. Did the Pharaoh step 1 plan have an effect? No. Why? The more he burdened them, the more what? The bigger they got. Step 1, not happening. Not working. That's right. Because God's in control. We know that. Maybe Pharaoh is probably wondering, well, why is this not working? I don't know. Verse 15. Step 2 of his plan. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it's a son, you shall kill him. But if it's a daughter, you shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, Why have you done this, and let the male children live? The midwife said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt with the midwives, and the people upon grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. What was step 2 to Pharaoh's plan to deal with this? Kill the males at birth. Kill the males at birth. The Hebrew boys burned. Midwives, what do you do? Destroy it. That will for sure control this population, control what we're trying to do. Think about that for a second. If that plan had succeeded, what would happen is this whole future generation of men would be gone, right? And I think it's presumably that the Hebrew daughters, if you will, would probably eventually intermarry or given as marriage as slaves to the Egyptian race. But basically the point is everybody would assimilate, and that would be the end of it, is really what it comes down to. There wouldn't be potentially a separate people as we currently are right now. But these two midwives outwitted almighty Pharaoh, which was God's plan all along. In preparing for this class, I was reading many books, but one of the books I was reading suggested, I thought this was interesting, I don't know if it's true necessarily, but suggested this is the first instance in Scripture of what we call today civil disobedience. Think about that for a second. So the Pharaoh said, this is the law, you do this. They didn't do it. They basically refused to obey an evil law for a higher, more noble purpose or good. I hadn't thought about that necessarily, which, if that's true, that may be interesting. Of course, we read in Acts chapter 5, I think we all understand that when the laws of God are contrary to the laws of men, who do we serve? The laws of God, obviously. The laws of God, obviously. We see that exemplified from the midwives here, but also we read about that later on in the Hebrew Bible with Daniel, his friends, further examples, the apostles in the New Testament. But again, the point is, Pharaoh's step 2 plan did not work. Any questions, thoughts about that? It's getting bleak here, right? Step 1, not happening. Step 2, not happening. There's a step 3. Look in verse 22. Verse 22. Then Pharaoh commanded all of his people, notice all the people, commanded all of his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews, you shall cast them into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Okay? So if we're not going to use midwives to try to kill these Hebrew boys, I tell you what, if you're an Egyptian and you see a Hebrew boy being burned, I don't know if you do it yourself, you tell someone so we can throw them in the sacred Nile River. And so hopefully this way he'll be able to control these birth rates and everything like that. So Pharaoh changed his plan. He commanded all of his people to see to it that, again, these Hebrew boys would be thrown into the sacred Nile River. So on the one hand, maybe Pharaoh couldn't maybe check up, if you will, on every Jewish midwife, if you will. So he solicited and commanded the broader, it appears, Egyptian population to get it on this bandwagon and help him out in that sense. But as we know the story, there's going to be one boy that Pharaoh couldn't kill. But any questions before we talked about the deliverer who's going to be born? Any thoughts, questions? Doug?
There was a Pharaoh that didn't know Joseph. That's a prequel to there arose a generation that didn't know God.
That's right.
And what that's saying is Pharaoh didn't know God. He didn't have any respect for him, or he might not have even known him.
Yep.
And so anytime you hear this phrase, it's kind of like there's disaster pending now. And even today, there may be things that we don't agree with spiritually that this country does spiritually, whether it's swearing on the Bible. There are a lot of states trying to do away with that for oaths of office. And even though you may or may not agree with that, that is kind of the highest name you can swear by that is still kind of recognized in the law. And they're trying to do away with that, whether it's the in God we trust on the money. Right. Whatever it is, there's going to arise a generation that doesn't even know God. And I think that's the reason it's so important that we stay righteous so that, as in Genesis we learn, the righteous preserve the nation.
That's right. That's right. No, excellent point. Excellent point. It is maybe ironic. Ironic is probably the wrong word, but we're people that easily forget, or easily, maybe forget promises. We're going to see that with the Israelites. They had that problem too, and I don't think that's just an Israelite problem. I think it's all of our problems to a certain degree. John?
I think it's easy for us to love freedom, who we are as a American people, and maybe even more so in Texas or whatever. But their success here under oppression is not a one-time event. We see that again many times throughout the Old Testament, specifically with the remnant. Early church grows the fastest under oppression. I think anecdotally through history we see that as well. So I think we have to remember, as people of God, and when we think about freedom and how we understand these things, more people are saved under oppression in times of persecution than times of freedom.
I think that's historically accurate. I was listening to a podcast a couple weeks ago that was making that point, that it's blessed we live in the time we live in terms of the freedoms we enjoy, but historically, the spread of the gospel historically takes place during times of oppression. That's just factually accurate throughout history. Yeah, good point. Good point. Oh, sure. From a deity perspective, the pharaohs, of course. Yep. Pharaohs consider themselves as deities, events. Not events, but people. Okay. Let's move on to the deliverer. The deliverer. Chapter 2, first 10 verses. I tell you what, for time, let's not read that. Let's just kind of talk through it. I think we understand. I think we understand what happened in terms of a little boy named who? Moses. Moses. Who were Moses' parents? Who was his parents? Okay, yes, that was the tribe. Yep, well done. What was their names? You remember? It's not said here. You have to know the places. Terry, you know? Yep. Well done, Terry. Well done. Amram and Jochebed are his parents. So think about this for a second. Think about their faith, okay? You know what the rules are, right, in terms of what Pharaoh has instituted. What does it say about their faith that they would still be producing children, you think? Well, not just them, but think about any of these Hebrews for that matter. What kind of faith do you think they would have to have? Okay. Right. Like the apostle, we must obey God rather than men. Okay, yeah. To me, I think you have to have extreme faith in this difficult situation, right? Was Moses the only child? No. Do you have a sister? What was her name? Miriam. She was the oldest. Do you have a brother? Aaron. How much older was Aaron than Moses? 3 years. Miriam, Aaron, Moses. So think about the faith to still be producing children. I mean, we're talking about one family here, in this period of time. I think that is a pretty faithful thing to do in this difficult day and time of Pharaoh. Hebrews chapter 11 actually commends both Moses' father and his mother for their great faith and trusting God during these, during this time. Albert.
You mentioned faith. It wasn't decided at that moment. I am making a huge presumption, but it was a long-term faith, time and time again, that they knew what they were going to do. So I wouldn't use the word premeditated, but it was just thought out beforehand, and it wasn't decided upon. I think would be safe to say that.
A lifestyle of faith, right? In a lifestyle of faith, different extenuating circumstances is not going to change that, right? Your point? Yeah, that's good. Okay, so what happened? So baby Moses is born. Justin, you have a point back up. Okay. Thanks, Ian.
With Aaron being so close in age to Moses, is there any evidence or speculation that he would have been born during that period of civil disobedience of the midwives?
It's not known, but yes, that is a pretty valid hypothesis, I would suggest. Yeah. Because to Albert's point, this whole Exodus chapter 1 scene is not a point in time in the sense of, hey, for the next 2 months is what it, no, this is a broader situation going on in the land of Egypt. Yep. Yep. Which again speaks to their faith, right? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so Moses is born. Ironically, does he end up in the Nile? Yeah. Maybe not in the way that Pharaoh had instructed him to go into the Nile, but yeah, he's put in the Nile. He's put into a basket. Who finds him? We know this. That's right. Basically a princess of the Egyptian court, right? A princess of the Egyptian court. She takes baby Moses out. What does she do? She, in essence, adopts him, right? Adopts him as part of her family. Put up here, what advantages does his adoption provide for Moses? What do you think? Everything. Thank you, Robert. Yes, every advantage. Well done. Yes. Think specifically about what Moses is going to eventually do, his destiny. What advantages did this adoption provide besides living for his future purpose? I think that's a big one, Terry. He provided one, an Egyptian education. An Egyptian education. I think that's going to come into play here over the next 40, 50 years. Ian?
Yeah, I mean, the education is key. I think it just gives him, he has access, right? Moses, because of who he was raised under, had access to the Pharaoh, and we need that. Obviously, we see that's a crucial part of the story, but also the impact that has, that somebody so close to the Pharaoh would completely turn
That's right.
180 and serve the true God and be willing to sacrifice everything, does sacrifice everything that he had in Egypt to represent God and to execute his plan and his purpose for his people.
Totally agree. This adoption provided a favored position in the land. He was given a special education, which, again, we're going to get back to later on in this story. Fun fact number 2, Moses, in the Egyptian language, Moses means born or son. That's interesting. Born or son. Of course, as I already mentioned in Hebrew, it means to draw out. Which I think, Harrison, to your point, that can mean 2 different things, right? Yes, Moses was drawn out of the Nile, but also, as we know, his future destiny is going to draw the people out of Egypt as well. In Acts chapter 7, Steve gives us some more information about the story of young Moses. We read this in Acts 7:22, that he grew in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. Moses, maybe we'll say racial identity is out of a Hebrew, but Moses, at this point, he was Egyptian. In fact, later in the story, we're going to read that people saw him and thought he was Egyptian as well. So culturally, the way he looked, maybe the way he dressed, I don't know, he was, in all accounts, an Egyptian from this perspective. Okay, let's move on then. Okay, so we know what happened. We know that story, if you will. But there was an issue. Look in verse 11, chapter 2, verse 11. And again, my fault, guys. We're not going to read this. Look in verse 11 through 15. We know the story, though. Let's talk about it just verbally, right? Moses goes out. He's looking over some stuff. What does he see? Injustice. From who? An Egyptian is what? On his people, on Hebrews, right? Moses, what does he do? He kills the Egyptian. Which is interesting, though. The story doesn't end there, though. What happens next, though? He kills the Egyptian. Apparently, what was perceived to be secret thing. Turned out it wasn't so secret, right? So he goes out and he sees who other quarreling. Exactly, 2 Hebrews. And what did they say to him when he kind of rebuked them and said, "What are you doing? What are you going to do? You going to kill me too?" And then basically Moses realized that this event, maybe private event, wasn't so private anymore, that it was a known situation. And so what do we read about? What was the fallout of that? Okay, got to get out of here. got to get out of here. Look in verse, actually I took the verses off of the screen up there, but at the bottom of the screen, the last sentence, second last sentence is, when Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. So whatever good graces Moses had, those have now gone out the window. And so Pharaoh wants to kill Moses. And so Moses, he leaves Pharaoh, he flees, goes to the land of Midian, where you sit down by a well. Ultimately, we know the story, guys. Marries, has some children out in the land of Midian. I will make a clarifying comment, though, just actually two things I mentioned. One, Stephen tells us again in Acts chapter 7, when he expands upon the story of Moses, that Moses was 40 years old when this event took place. Okay? So again, he lived 40 years at presumably Pharaoh's court. So I think that's significant. So that's one thing. But then second thing, just to clarify, chapter 2, verse 11, when it talks about he looked on the burns, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, right? So before he kills him, beating a Hebrew. Fair disclosure, there was some confusion on what that term beating means, the verb there. In Hebrew, beating could mean like, just beating someone up, or like beating to the point of death. So it's entirely presumably possible and probably likely that it wasn't just a beating situation. This was, hey, this Egyptian is killing this Hebrew. And that is when Moses intervened to stop this bloodshed, if you will. So just a clarifying comment there. Okay. Regardless, Moses fled, I should say. He becomes a fugitive. He goes to the land of Midian. He settles in Midian, marries, has children, as we've talked about. So think about that. This man who was mighty in words and deeds in the Egyptian court, what is he doing in Midian? You remember? He's in pastures tending stubborn sheep. See any irony there? About what he's going to do? Right? Right? Fast forward years later, these principles he's learned, I'm assuming, make an assumption here, about pasturing stubborn sheep, yeah, that's going to come real handy later on. Maybe not all the Egyptian court jazz, but maybe some lessons, some principles he learned managing these stubborn sheep in Midian would come into play in a very big way. Yeah, Mike.
Passed by this, and I've been going back and reading. Like, am I reading right? This is way back, and I'm sorry. But in verse 8 of chapter 2, when it says Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go ahead," so the girl went and called the child's mother. Is this implying that like they called just hand cherry picked Moses' actual mother to be the one raising him? I mean, because that certainly could have a lot of implication on what came after. It's just such a quick little pass by.
Agreed. Yeah, I think that's the correct interpretation. Yes. Now the rationale, I think, speaks to the providence of God. Obviously, I think it's not. I shouldn't say obviously. I don't think it's mentioned here. Other places talks about how Miriam was watching over the child, right? And when she says, "Hey, I need a Hebrew midwife," she says, "Hey, I've got just the one." That it was actually his birth mother. But no, I think that's a correct interpretation, Mike. Again, speaking to the providence of God. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's talking about like through all of this character and who raised him character.
Well, that's a good point. So I wonder. This is speculation, of course. I wonder if maybe that's where he got his Hebrew roots. You know what I mean? Yeah. That even though I dress like an Egyptian, I talk like an Egyptian, I'm part of the Egyptian court, I know where I came from. Yeah. Ian and then Robert. Ian, do you have something?
Yeah, I was just going to say that it's pretty profound to think about it in that regard, because you see the faith of the parents is the whole reason why Moses ends up where he is, and clearly they had a faith with Aaron and all their children. So God is in a way protecting the entire family, right? Not just Moses, but
sure, yeah.
the entire family during this trying period. And that would really make sense why, when he sees Hebrews being beat, that he's reached a point where he's 40 years old and he's seen this for so long, he just can't take it anymore. He can't even control his own actions. He has to act. And I think that's really powerful, because you see where God is touching his heart, You know what I mean? And his heart isn't hard anymore. It's becoming soft and open to the true God.
Hit the first bell, Robert. Number one.
Just really quick, to yours and Mike's point, of course his mother is where his character, his belief, his understanding, his knowledge of God came from. And where do you think he had the ability to hide that so well?
That's right.
That's what they had to do for the last 100 years or 50
Necessity.
years.
Right? Necessity, yeah. Okay, all good points. Thank you. Okay, 5 minutes. I would say the key to these first two chapters, I don't say the key, but basically how to bring this back together. Chapter 2, verse 23. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out to help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. Is that not just profound, encouraging, awe-inspiring? All this calamity, this bondage, this suffering, these attempts by Pharaoh to just completely decimate the population, to murder, to kill, all this stuff. The children cry out to God. It says, God remembered. God remembered the promises he had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so the point is, God's about to act. And God's about to act in a very, very big way. And really, the rest of the entire book of Exodus is about the action God took to provide deliverance and to provide relief for his people. Any questions about that? Rick?
Not so much a question, but one more observation about Moses. So here he was raised at the high court, kingly, surroundings.
Everything that provided, yeah.
And he ends up taking this job in a foreign land as a shepherd. As you noted, it's going to help in his shepherding of the people. It also shows that remember in Egyptian culture, that was like the lowest job.
Yeah, good point. Yep.
Because when the Israelites came out, hey, you guys sit over there,
Yep.
we're not so fond of shepherds. And it goes to the point that we're told later on that he was the meekest among them. And he's willing to take that job, even though he was raised this way, he takes this lowliest of job. It's going to be to his benefit longer term, but it's all part of God's providence of getting the right person at the right time to lead his people out.
Excellent point. Yep. Which is a good transition point. Do you see any parallels to Jesus from these first two chapters, Brian?
It says here that God covenant.
And of course, God remembered his covenant. And of course, his covenant was that I will give you this land where he would give his people rest,
Yep.
that he would raise up Abraham's descendants and bless them
Yep.
and make them into a great nation.
Yep.
And through Abraham's descendants, God would bless all nations. And of course, we read in Galatians 3:16, that promised blessing was Jesus Christ.
Right. Yep. No, that's good. That's good. Quickly, Michael?
It's quick, yes. Rick, I was with you at the meekest on, I was just reading that in Numbers 12, verse 8, it says, or verse 2, Moses was very meek, more meek than all people who were on the face of the earth.
Yep.
Like, whoa. I don't know. That jumped
Significant,
out at me.
right?
Yes. Could that be said about any of us?
Good point. Good point. Okay, I'm going to leave you with this. We have maybe 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Parallels between the coming gospel, Jesus, and what we just read the first two chapters. Matthew 2 gives us several parallels between Moses, the deliverer, and obviously Jesus being a deliverer in his own right. Remember, one, where does Jesus end up? Egypt. So he's drawn out of Egypt, which was to fulfill prophecy in Scripture, one coming to draw out of Egypt. Of course, Herod gives the orders to kill the baby boys. We're familiar with that story. Think about this one. This is maybe a little obscure, I guess. The Israelites experienced 400 years, as we talked about, of bondage, dark bondage in Egypt until Moses was born to come and deliver them through God's providence. Think about this. How long was it the time between the Testaments, the dark time we call it? That was 400 years as well. So another 400 years of silence between the testaments, if you will, and Jesus was born to come and deliver his people out of sin, out of oppression, out of bondage, to salvation. Moses was royalty in Egypt, but left his position of power, Rick, to your point, to serve and save and enslave people. Of course, Jesus, being the Son of God, left his royal position to come and serve and enslave the world as us. Finally, I'll leave you with one more. Moses was both royal and slave at the same time, being a prince of Egypt, but also Hebrew. Is that not Jesus, the Son of God? Jesus the Christ was both royalty and a slave here on this earth to save us from sins. So again, the point being, there are some, I think, direct correlations, connotations that we should make between what we read about in Exodus for the continuity of the future gospel. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. We're going to do chapters 3 and 4 next week.